Baldur's Gate 3 has exploded in popularity, and it would be fair to say it's one of the most popular games in Steam's launch history. And that's also reflected in the reviews too, sitting at overwhelmingly positive, something like 96% at the time of recording. But the question is it worth it? Is it right for you? Does it suit a D&D noob? What genre does it even fit in? So in this video, I'm going to share my thoughts and answer some of those common questions that I heard on stream today about Baldur's Gate 3 and reflect a little bit on what the full release version is like. So sit back and relax, let's jump in. And the first thing that you'll notice is the character creator. You've been watching it for about 35 seconds, and that kind of leads me through into my first point. What's the role of D&D in this game? Is it just a Dungeons and Dragons simulator, or is there more to it than that? And of course, the skills that you pick up at the start are very important. They'll play a key role not just in combat, as you're exploring the world, but also, of course, as you can see here, as you're interacting with characters. And I'll try and show you a variety of different clips in the background so that as I'm talking about the things, you can see them play out as well. Here, a successful role probably gets me out of a little bit of trouble, and maybe a character who is less charismatic or less persuasive might not have reached that same outcome. And that is, of course, part of the Dungeons and Dragons experience, that constantly evolving story that it presents to you. My general takeaway, in terms of, is this a D&D game? Do I need to be a D&D expert to play it? Is no. No. The version that they use is relatively easy to understand. And for the record, I say this as somebody who has never sat down around a table and played a game of Dungeons and Dragons in real life. So you can absolutely say that I was approaching this as a noob. Did I find it difficult? Honestly, no. The big roles, the ones that we're grappling with when we're talking to people, are very easy to understand. And then inside of combat and as you're exploring the world, it maybe gets a little bit more complicated. But thankfully, the game handles a lot of it for you. The dice rolls are almost automatic when they're not these big, ceremonious, cinematic ones related to key dialogue pieces in the story. We'll talk about combat a little bit later, and I'll show you it there. In this clip, by the way, and as a little bit of an anecdote for how Baldur's Gate 3 might actually play, outside of that D&D conundrum, this alleged healer offered to allegedly heal me, and instead they decided to poison me because they thought that getting rid of me, the problem, would be easier than healing me. And you know what? They could be right, they could be wrong. I'm with a party of characters who also have a lot of skills, but different ones, so we can lean into their experiences too. But one of the beautiful things about Baldur's Gate 3, here I am leaving the conversation, is you can kind of do whatever you like. Here I am deciding, actually, you know what? You poisoned me, and now I'm going to teach you a lesson. So I trigger combat mode as I'm walking around in the real world by carrying out a stealthy sneak attack. And now my merry band of frankly pretty odd travelers have come together to destroy this so-called healer. And I think that it's just one small, relatively spoiler-free example of the kinds of things that Baldur's Gate 3 offers, and one of the reasons why it was able to appeal to me as, in case you're not familiar or you're new to the channel, largely a strategy gamer. I play games like Civilization 6, Humankind, Age of Wonders, etc, etc, etc. And as we'll talk about later, there's certainly a strategic layer to this game, but that is not it really at all. Or perhaps more accurately, I should say, it delivers much more than just a strategic combat system. As you can tell by the example we've just gone through, this is an RPG, obviously, but it's an incredibly story-rich one. One where you basically have a sandbox of opportunity. You're not led down one path. And you'll find that even when you're outside of the specific story options or the dialogue like we were looking at before, here I am with my merry band of friends exploring the world. We get caught in some vines. Unfortunate, but don't worry, I can come back and help you out if you can't rescue yourself. One of the many small, relatively insignificant, to be honest, examples of the kind of world that Baldur's Gate 3 builds. Of course, we're walking around in the third person, exploring as we go, and maybe a more perceptive character, to lean back into the skills that we were talking about earlier, might discover that they can dig up some treasure or find an item that would otherwise be a secret, a truly hidden item. But thanks to their perception or whatever skill may play out in any specific example, they're able to dig it up and find it. And what that means is that Baldur's Gate 3 is a branching story almost like no other. For example, as you're walking around the world, the perceptive person will find something that others won't, but maybe a strong character will be able to push something out of the way and reveal an entirely new zone on the map. And this continues on and on and on. But of course, it really plays out in the story, whether it's a side quest or a main one. Here's a clip, for example, again, relatively close to the start of the game. This one I stripped straight from the stream highlights from earlier today. I'm leaning into this disgusting squid-like creature, likely responsible for infecting my mind. And I decide, you know what, I'm going to take one of the odd options. I'm going to lean in for a kiss. Not quite the bear love scene that you might have seen explode onto the internet, but no, everything's fine. Let me lean in. I trust you, you trust me. One big, warm, wet, tentacle-wrapped family. And unfortunately for me, not quite so much. I'm perfectly happy and perfectly dead. Game over. But you don't need to fear the game over, because of course you can reload. A quick tip, by the way, the game doesn't tend to save all that often. You might want to just take a quick note and save every now and again manually. But the point that's sort of more important here is that sometimes, splat, the branching story options can open up entirely new avenues. Literally whole new quest lines, introduce you to whole new characters. It just keeps giving. And that's one of the things that I find leaves me with an itch that I want to scratch. I can't help but think, what if I'd done that differently? And so next time I'm approaching a character, I'm way more aggressive than last time, because I think actually maybe aggression will pay. And I think to summarize this section, that's one of the real beauties of Baldur's Gate 3. It has these highly connected narratives, but they're also completely different. How you're exploring the world and the worldview of your character has a dramatic impact on the kinds of things you'll find and discover, and almost certainly you'll go down incredible rabbit holes where you're like, how did I get here? Why am I kissing a squid? And then it all comes back together again. Shifting through a little bit now to talk more specifically about the combat system, another one of the most significant systems in the game, outside of the D&D, the stories, the charismatic storytelling, is the combat. Here it is effectively a turn-based combat system. I am hesitant to liken it to any game because whenever I do, people will flame me because it's incorrect. So I'm going to keep it at a pretty high level and say turn-based strategic combat. Strategic combat in what way, you might ask? Well, all of the ways you might expect. For example, different elevations, different types of cover will dramatically impact how you fight. And then, of course, the kind of character that you build will as well. A spell-casting wizard will have just an absurd myriad of options, like really nuts. A quick tip that I would recommend if you're watching this and maybe slightly new is that you might want to lean into more of a brute-like character, I swing sword kind of vibes, because it'll be easier as you sort of move through, progress, and you'll find that you have fewer decisions to make in the fight. And you can see that here when I'm selecting one of my melee characters, more roguelike, they tend to have fewer abilities. Of course, as you move through and get used to them, and at least this is my experience, it'll become a lot less overwhelming. So I wouldn't stress too much. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, you're building up a character, not just one, not just two, but actually a band of 4. Each one has their own story, their own quests and missions, their own goals, and sometimes they'll run counter to yours. But the beauty of them is that they'll all present different skills. So don't worry, you can be a brute fighter, and then you'll come across a wizard, and now all of a sudden you have the best of both worlds in your party. I would also note that party composition I don't think is quite as stressful or tenuous as some may have made it out to be. Absolutely, if you want to swat up on it, learn all about it, and get it perfect, you'll have a better time, inside of fights and outside of them. But it's not something that I would stress too much about, because despite Baldur's Gate 3's relative complexities, and certainly lots of detail going on underneath, it actually presents the game in a way that's pretty easy to pick up. You know, if we take the combat system here, for example, up the top, you've got your turn order. Down the bottom, you've got your actions. You can only generally take one normal action, and then you have bonus actions that you can take as well. This isn't a beginner's tips and tricks video, I've already done that, but the point that I'm trying to make is that everything is flexible and nothing is quite as daunting as it may or may not first seem. And I think it's that balancing between complexity and ease that's one of this game's greatest selling points. Here I am leveling up my characters, and again I'm left with lots of choices. I can keep them relatively simple, move up through, get some extra features, extra health, or I can choose to wildly diversify, adding potentially a whole extra class into the mix, a multi-type. Again, as we talked about earlier, some more complex than others, adding spells can certainly feel overwhelming, and you might just think, oh my god, there's so much to choose from. And you'd be right. It will take a bit of time to get used to that. Don't get me wrong, everything isn't completely perfect and rosy, but man, it is dang close. It really is. I say this, by the way, to clarify, because I always seem to need to. Not a sponsored video. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I have nothing to do with these people. I'm just sharing what I think. Back to the topic at hand. Overall, I think it really does a good job at allowing you freedom and agency. And that's, I think, what a lot of us really want. We want to be able to tell our own story, build our own characters, explore the world in our own way. And Baldur's Gate 3 achieves that almost unlike any other game. Not just from the individual dialogue perspectives, but everything else that we've talked about in this video. Of course, the downsides of having such a massive world are fairly numerous. You'll hear a lot of people talk about Baldur's Gate. It's a city, by the way. But you probably won't reach it for quite some time. At least 15 hours. I've heard other people talk about 20, 30, 35. It depends a bit, perhaps, on your journey. It's certainly hyped up. You might not get there anytime soon, though. You could also argue that that's not a bad thing. It kind of also has a way of just completely letting you miss things. Larian Studios seems to have not held back on that at all. They don't care if you find every inch, nook, and cranny in a playthrough. I can't but help assume that they're probably thinking you'll do multiple playthroughs. But the point here is that you can just completely miss stuff. Just completely, entirely. And I'm not talking about being too dumb to solve a puzzle or missing a bit of loot, although I'm really guilty of that. More missing entire story arcs and storylines. So just keep that in mind, that one of the potentially perceived downsides of such a massive world is that you might actually miss out on some really cool and important stuff because you're a bit lost, a bit confused, or you don't have the necessary skills to get it. If you can't speak to animals, for example, you should probably have someone in your party who can, then you can entirely miss things. And that's just one relatively small example. It handles it in some interesting ways. The world, absolutely ginormous, so of course there's a fast travel mechanic built into the game. I think generally it's a really great one. You can use it almost anywhere you like, even if you're trapped deep inside of some sort of twisting, winding dungeon, you can just, whoop, fast travel out of there. However, I have seen some people criticize this, criticize it for arguably, ultimately kind of letting you cheese it a bit, letting you miss stuff a bit, or maybe taking the gravity away from such an important piece in the story. I personally think it's nice to have the flexibility, and I think it probably leans into the overall design philosophy that we've talked about throughout this entire video, that this is a story-rich, open world almost, sandbox RPG, with a strategic layer of combat that's turn-based, very detailed, but again, as you can see here, I'm not having to roll the die every time. As I mentioned earlier, the game does a pretty good job at handling it for you, even if the damage indicators might feel a bit misleading or confusing at first. Please share your thoughts below on what you think about Baldur's Gate 3. The comment sections on these videos are almost always outstanding, and there's usually stuff that I've overlooked, said wrong in my lack of script writing preparedness, or just haven't experienced. So let me know below, and I'll see you all next time.